Stay until the end of this video because I will tell you what were the last words of one of the most powerful and feared drug traffickers the world has ever known. You will discover the secret that exposed him after decades of evasion. You will learn the identity of the person who, without knowing it, handed over the most wanted man in Mexico and the United States. You will understand how a barefoot boy who watched over avocado fields in the poorest land of Michoacan became the individual with the highest reward in Latin America. And you will hear, in the voices of the witnesses who saw him die, what happened in the final moments of the man known around the world as El Mencho. There are names that weigh more than titles. There are names that, when whispered in certain regions of Mexico, make people lower their eyes and change the subject. There are names that for more than 15 years represented not a person but a force, a shadow, something closer to a natural phenomenon than a human being of flesh and blood. Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes was one of those names. For the government of the United States, he was the #1 priority target in the Western Hemisphere, with a $15 million reward offered by the Drug Enforcement Administration. For the Mexican government, he was the leader of the most violent criminal organization operating in the country in decades. For millions of people in the states of Jalisco, Michoacan, Colima, Guanajuato, and dozens of other regions, his name represented fear in its most concrete form. But to understand how El Mencho's story ended, you first have to understand how it began. And for that, you have to travel far back in time. You have to travel to a Mexico many prefer not to remember. Onyegalila is a municipality that seems forgotten by time and by the state. It is nestled in the region known as Tierra Caliente in Michoacan, a mountainous and arid territory where the heat crushes for months and where the central government has always arrived late, if at all. In July 1966, in that geography of neglect, Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes was born. Those who knew him as a child say he was a thin boy, dark-skinned from the sun, yet who dropped out of school after the 5th grade because his family could not afford to keep him in the classroom. Needs were more urgent than education. So Nemesio, still a child, hired himself out to work in the only thing available in that region, the fields. Some reports indicate that he worked guarding avocado plantations owned by the Valencia brothers, a family that decades later would play a very different role in his life. It seemed at first like a common destiny, or the destiny of tens of thousands of young people born into rural poverty in Mexico, condemned to manual labor under a relentless sun, with no visible horizon beyond the furrow and the harvest. But Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes would not settle for that destiny. At some point in the 1980s, following a path already taken by many young men from the region, he crossed the border into the United States without documents. For many, the northern border was the only visible exit from poverty. Some found honest work there. Others found something very different. Nemesio found drugs, not as a consumer but as a business. In California, the young man from Aguililla began to connect with the world of drug trafficking. It was a world he had heard about since childhood in Michoacan, where illegal crops were no secret to those who lived in Tierra Caliente. But in California, he learned the other side of the business: distribution, money, networks, and he also learned the consequences. In 1992, he was arrested. The Federal Court of the Northern District of California prosecuted him. In 1994, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for conspiracy to traffic heroin. He served his sentence and was deported to Mexico. What happened next is one of those episodes in criminal history that seems possible only in reality, never in fiction. He returned to Mexico and obtained employment as a municipal police officer in the state of Jalisco. A man convicted of drug trafficking in the United States, deported as a criminal, became a law enforcement officer in Mexico. The uniform that was supposed to symbolize the law became for him a school of intelligence. He learned how police operations worked. He learned the weaknesses of the system. Above all, he learned who had to be corrupted and how much it cost. It did not take long for him to leave the uniform and definitively cross to the other side. The Valencia brothers, whom he had known in his childhood in Aguililla, by then had their own criminal organization known as the Milenio Cartel, operating in Jalisco and Michoacan. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes joined their ranks, first as a hitman, later as head of security. He was efficient, loyal, and absolutely ruthless, qualities highly valued in that world. Then, at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, Mexico's criminal landscape convulsed. The Sinaloa cartel, led by Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera, on the infamous El Chapo, had declared total war against Los Zetas and their allies. Ignacio Coronel Villarreal, one of the leaders of the Milenio cartel, was killed in July 2010 during a Mexican army operation in Zapopan, Jalisco. The organization was left headless, and Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes took its head. In that vacuum of power, together with a nucleus of trusted men, he founded what would become the most violent and feared organization in Mexico, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. From that moment on, the world would learn to fear that name. And his. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel was not born as just another organization. It was born as a declaration of war against everyone, against Los Zetas, against the authorities, against any organization that dared dispute territory. El Mencho, as he was already universally known, imposed a culture of systematic terror that his own messages did not bother to disguise. In the early years of the organization, the messages left next to bodies found in different states of Mexico were so explicit in their brutality that security analysts who studied them admitted they had seen few things like it in the context of Latin American organized crime. The expansion of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel was vertiginous. In barely 5 years, the organization went from being a local gang operating in Jalisco and Michoacán to having presence in 21 Mexican states. It established trafficking routes to the United States, diversified income through stolen fuel from Pemex pipelines, extortion of merchants, farmers, and businessmen, kidnapping, and above all, fentanyl. Fentanyl would become, in the 21st century, the deadliest commodity any drug trafficker had ever sold. A synthetic opioid between 50 and 100 times more potent than morphine, capable of killing with doses invisible to the human eye. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel became one of the main suppliers of fentanyl to the U.S. market, placing it at the center of the opioid crisis that consumed hundreds of thousands of American families. The Mexican government's response did not take long. Or rather, it did take too long. On June 22, 2015, the Mexican army carried out an operation in the municipality of Villa Purificación in southern Jalisco, with intelligence that El Mencho might be hiding there. And what happened next was one of the most spectacular and terrifying episodes in recent Mexican narco history. The cartel's men did not flee or surrender. They counterattacked with a level of firepower no one had anticipated. A Mexican army helicopter was shot down with a rocket launcher. 9 soldiers died. The battle spread across several municipalities in Jalisco. Cartel gunmen blocked roads in the Guadalajara area to prevent reinforcements from advancing. 39 buses, 11 banks, more than 16 gas stations were set on fire. The attack spread across 20 municipalities and 3 neighboring states. El Mencho escaped. And that image, of a state unable to capture a criminal who shot down military helicopters, was etched into Mexico's collective memory as a symbol of how far the narco had surpassed the state in operational capacity. The authorities did not give up, but they did not succeed for years. For the next decade, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes became something like a ghost. He moved unpredictably. He rarely stayed more than a few days in the same place. His inner circle was extraordinarily small. It was said he suffered from chronic health problems, particularly kidney issues, requiring periodic medical care, both a vulnerability and an unavoidable necessity. The authorities never found him. Meanwhile, his own son, Ruben Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, did not have the same luck. He was arrested in Mexico in 2015, escaped, was captured again in 2022, extradited to the United States, and sentenced to life imprisonment in federal court. For El Mencho, that sentence was, according to people close to the organization who later spoke to authorities, one of the hardest personal blows of his life, because El Menchito was his blood. But El Mencho remained free, until he made the mistake that all fugitives eventually make, a human mistake, a mistake of the heart. On Thursday, To February 20th, 2026, Mexican intelligence analysts working in coordination with U.S. intelligence detected unusual movement. Someone close to Oseguera Cervantes was heading to a location in the mountains of Tapalpa, Jalisco. Tapalpa is a misty mountain town, famous as a weekend tourist destination. It seemed like the last place the world's most wanted drug trafficker would hide, which made it perfect. The person tracked was a romantic partner of El Mencho. Authorities later confirmed it was that trail that led special forces to the cabin in the mountains where he waited, unaware it would be the last coordinate of his life as a free man. The operation was activated in the early hours of Sunday, February 22, 2026. Mexican Army Special Forces and the National Guard, supported by real-time intelligence, closed the perimeter around Tapalpa. At dawn, they initiated the assault. The security group around El Mencho opened fire immediately. Soldiers responded. The firefight was intense. 4 cartel members died. 3 soldiers were wounded. El Mencho retreated into the forest with his closest bodyguards. Soldiers pursued him. In the second confrontation among the trees, he was shot. He was found wounded, surrounded. Medical teams attempted to stabilize him. An air evacuation was requested. A helicopter transported him alive toward Mexico City. He did not arrive. At some point over the mountains and valleys of western Mexico, Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes stopped breathing. It was approximately 11 a.m. on Sunday, February 22, 2026. He was 59 years old. There were no recorded last words, no statement, no speech, no solemnity, only silence. And then, somewhere between the mountains of Jalisco and Mexico City, in a helicopter flying over the country he had marked so brutally for more than 15 years, Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes ceased to exist. Was that justice? Or simply the inevitable end of a life built on violence that could only end in violence? I leave that to you. Leave your answer in the comments. Do you think El Mencho should have been captured, extradited, and formally tried in the United States? Or was the way it ended the only possible outcome for someone who, for 20 years, had demonstrated that no institution could contain him? And tell me as well, from where are you watching this video? In your country, does justice arrive on time? Or does El Mencho's story feel familiar for closer reasons? Write it below.